Are human beings still evolving? Well, there are three main processes by which evolution progresses. There are others, but there are three main ones that I want to consider. The first and most widely known is the idea of the survival of the fittest. This means that if a particular genetic makeup leads to a phenotype that gives an individual a survival, or more precisely, a reproductive advantage, that individual will produce more offspring, which are more likely to contain a copy of the gene which provided that advantage. So, for example, if an individual carries a gene that makes them more resistant to the cold, then in periods of greater cold, such as an ice age, for example, that individual will have a survival advantage and leave behind more offspring. Or an individual with white fur, perhaps through some genetic mutation, will have a survival advantage in a snowy region over one that has darker fur. Eventually, this will lead to the fixation of this gene within the population. Over millennia, this has led to the diversity of species that we see today, with animals adapted to all kinds of niches where they've found an advantage, a survival advantage. Humans, though, have the unusual ability to adapt the environment to their needs rather than adapting to the environment. Thus, some of the selection pressure is certainly eased. We've been able to cure diseases, for example, or enable people with various conditions, diabetes, for example, to live longer, so that the reproductive advantage of not having this condition or of having a natural immunity to a disease is nullified. We've evened out the playing field to a large extent. The question can still be reasonably asked, are some groups within society producing more offspring than others, regardless of whether they have a particular genetic advantage or not? Even if this is true, this is unlikely to result in the elimination of other genotypes in the population, even if this particular genotype becomes numerically dominant, because these other groups are not being eliminated the way they might have been in an earlier period. So I suspect that this form of selection, survival of the fittest, is no longer operating very strongly on the human genome. The second type of evolution is the result of genetic drift. This can happen when, just by chance alone, a particular genotype spreads through the population. This genotype may not have any particular survival advantage, it's just a process of chance. However, this can be enhanced by stochastic events. If, for example, some natural disaster has a major impact on a population, those who survive are likely to be a genetic subgroup of the larger group. So their genotype is passed on, whereas others are lost. This is what we call a bottleneck event, when, often by chance alone, certain genotypes are eliminated from the population and others are passed along. If this happens within one human population but not another, then these populations will likely drift apart. This also happens if a subgroup moves away from the main group. They take with them a subset of the total gene pool of the population. Or if two populations become separated by some event, each subgroup again will carry only a subset of the total gene pool, and these two populations may drift apart over time. However, we have become a very mobile species. We move all over the world, and there's a high degree of mixing these days between different genotypes, perhaps even formerly isolated populations. This is going to operate against genetic drift in human beings. Finally, there's a process known as sexual selection. Some phenotypes may become attractive because of some feature that has no direct link to survivability, although it might have. For example, suppose an individual of a species that is usually brown develops a mutation such that it exhibits some blue colouring here and there. This novelty may turn out to be attractive to potential partners, even though it has nothing to do with the health or strength or survivability of that individual. This individual may have more reproductive success than its neighbours, leaving behind more offspring which might in turn carry this blue gene, which are more attractive, which attracted more partners, etc. This blue gene mutation may quickly spread through the population. Maybe in the human population, women prefer taller men, even though in modern society this offers no particular survival advantage. This will result slowly in a taller human population. Maybe blue eyes suddenly become popular and are seen as particularly attractive by potential mates. This will give blue-eyed individuals a reproductive advantage, even though blue-eyedness has no particular survival advantage. Perhaps even though our human populations have become quite mixed geographically, there's still a tendency for people to select a mate who shares certain ethnic or cultural characteristics. Perhaps there's even some cultural or social pressure in this direction. This can serve to genetically isolate these populations from each other, even though they're not geographically isolated. And this can lead to the kind of genetic drift that I described earlier. Is this kind of process beginning to break down within the human species? Is this third evolutionary process also becoming a thing of the past? I think it's reasonable to assume that the human species is, to a large extent, no longer subject to the evolutionary pressures that have operated on our species in the past, at least certainly not to the same extent. I can't say whether this will always be the case. We've learned to change our environment to meet our needs rather than adapting to our environment. And we have perhaps taken the changes that are occurring or will occur in our species into our own hands, enhancing ourselves with technology, for instance, or controlling our own genetic destiny through the direct manipulation of our genome. Welcome to the brave new world.